the ground. Next up, we're going to talk about pollution. We're going to start out by talking about pollution in general, and we're going to use a few vocabulary terms as we go. So make sure you know these. These are good for flashcards. So what is a pollutant? A pollutant is the introduction or presence of an agent I'm using as the most generic term possible, which could be chemicals, physical chemicals, or it could be a kind of energy, perhaps. So heat could count as a kind of pollutant. If those chemicals or that energy has a negative effect, a harmful or a poisonous effect on an ecosystem or on species within that ecosystem, we would call it a pollutant. And right away, we're going to separate pollutants into two general categories. These are quantitative pollutants and qualitative pollutants. So quantitative pollutants are things that are in the environment normally. They are normal environmental substances, but they could occur in such a high amount that they become unhealthy. They become pollutants from sheerly the volume of them. There's a phrase that toxicologists use, which is the poison is in the dosage, because any substance in a high enough concentration will become toxic or poisonous. As an example, I put carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a normal thing that's in our atmosphere. It's supposed to be there. Without carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, we would be in an ice age right now. Those gases have an incredibly important role in making sure that the temperature stays stable on Earth. But the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of methane that we've been pumping out into the atmosphere has made it a pollutant. It is the amount of it that has caused a problem. And now warming is getting higher and higher and higher. So CO2 would be a kind of quantitative pollutant. It's a normal substance that you always find in the atmosphere. It's just that its amount has become too high. So what is the other kind of pollutant? A qualitative pollutant. This is any substance that doesn't naturally occur in ecosystems, so it is toxic or polluting or harmful or poisonous in any quantity whatsoever. So insecticides, the kinds of poisons we spray on crops in order to keep insect populations down, those are qualitative pollutants. Now, they are meant to be harmful and poisonous in the places where we put them, but they also wash into waterways and they affect insect populations outside of just the farm where they're strictly sprayed. So a qualitative pollutant has the quality of being a pollutant. It has the innate characteristic of being harmful, whereas quantitative pollutants are not necessarily harmful unless their concentration gets too high. Mercury from burning coal would be another example of a qualitative pollutant. There's no amount of mercury that's supposed to be in the atmosphere. There's no amount of mercury that's supposed to be in food webs. Mercury doesn't have a biological function, so any amount of it is bad. Lead is like this as well. Lead from lead paint and leaded gasoline and things like that. Both of them neurotoxins, right? So they have the quality of being pollutants. They're qualitative. Now, those kinds of pollutants can be subdivided into two more categories. We have degradable pollutants and non-degradable pollutants. Degradable pollutants disappear gradually through natural means or engineered systems like municipal treatment, sewage treatment plants, ones that work with waste. So you could have a pesticide that is a qualitative pollutant, but it breaks down, right? It gets broken down when it gets into animal systems or it dissipates into the environment, and eventually it just gets converted into other types of chemicals through natural processes. That would be a degradable qualitative pollutant. You can also have quantitative pollutants, like, for example, thermal pollution, heat energy that, say, comes from a power plant and they just vent their hot water into the river. Well, that's a quantitative pollutant. Water is supposed to have some temperature. It's supposed to have a little bit of heat in it, but you can have too much of it, so the quantity becomes a problem. But heat dissipates naturally into the environment, so it will degrade over time. So you could have both qualitative and quantitative degradable pollutants. You also have non-degradable pollutants, which are substances that do not degrade, or they degrade so slowly that we can consider them as non-degradable pollutants. So mercury salts. Mercury I named as a qualitative pollutant. It is a qualitative non-degradable pollutant. And that's one of the things that makes it so dangerous, is that it sticks into the tissues of fish. It sticks into the tissues of humans that eat it as well. So over time, the amount of mercury in your system can go up and up and up and up because it's never degrading. So that is a qualitative non-degradable pollutant. Here I have a turtle that is caught in a net, and one of the things about plastics that's a big problem is that they biodegrade very, very slowly or not at all. So when we have municipal waste that washes into the ocean, frequently it is a non-degradable pollutant that is affecting animals. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a chemical that's poisoning their system or something like heat or noise that is impairing their ecosystem. It could be something like this that catches them in a net and is going to strangle them, prevent them from being able to hunt and swim and move around freely. Or it could actually end up choking them or constricting blood flow to one of their limbs. So these too can be pollutants. Now the reason why I'm harping on mercury as a pollutant early on here is that it's going to lead us into another concept that you guys need to know about. So mercury accumulates in biological tissues through a process called biomagnification. So it's contained inside crude oil and coal and other kinds of fossil fuels, and when those are burned, they release mercury into the atmosphere, methyl mercury into the atmosphere. And that will settle down and kind of come out of the air, and it'll work its way into the water. Well, the phytoplankton that are growing in the water will pull a little bit of that mercury into their tissues. So you'll get a little bit of mercury from the burning of coal into the phytoplankton. Those phytoplankton are going to be eaten by zooplankton. And again, mercury attaches to certain receptors, certain kinds of tissues. I think it accumulates in your fat cells, actually, over time. So the amount of mercury that's in the seawater is actually going to be lower than the amount of mercury that's in the phytoplankton, because they, as they're growing, are accumulating more and more of the mercury from their surroundings. They're hanging on to it. So there's going to be a higher concentration of mercury in the phytoplankton than in the seawater. But the zooplankton need to eat a lot of phytoplankton in order to meet their energy supplies. Remember back when we were talking about energy flow through ecosystems, we mentioned that every trophic level you go up, every time you go from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer and so on, only about 10% of the energy makes it through, so that means you need to actually eat a lot of food in order to meet your energy needs. So the zooplankton are eating these phytoplankton that have a lot of mercury in their system, and all that mercury from all of the phytoplankton that they're eating is accumulating in their system. So they need to eat a lot of phytoplankton to meet their energy needs, but all of the mercury that's in that phytoplankton, that is being stored inside. So the concentration of mercury inside the zooplankton is higher than in the phytoplankton. And then every trophic level we go up, we get the same issue. The fish that eat the zooplankton have to eat a lot of zooplankton, so they're taking in a lot more mercury, and the concentration of mercury in their tissues will be higher than in the zooplankton. Larger fish eat those smaller fish, and again, the amount of mercury in the tissues increases. So at every trophic level we move up, because of how much every kind of organism needs to eat in order to meet its energy requirements, you're getting more and more and more mercury built up, many, many times the concentration. So here it gives you a diagram of that. It shows the mercury kind of precipitating out of the atmosphere and getting into the seawater, where it's at 10 to the negative 7th parts per million. So very, very, very tiny concentrations. And then in the algae, it shows it as 10 to the negative 2 parts per million. So that's a little bit more concentrated. I'm not going to go over arithmetic right now, but the smaller the negative is, the bigger a number it is. So you can see we went from negative 7 to negative 2, so the concentration is getting higher. 10 to the 1 is 10, so now it's 10 parts per million. And the concentration increases in the apex predators as well, although I think there's a typo on this slide. So it gets even higher in those apex predators. This is why if you eat a lot of tuna, sometimes it'd be like, careful about all that mercury. Well, tuna actually are very large fish, so they are way up on this scale, and they have a lot more mercury in their tissues than smaller kinds of fish would probably have. And of course, the reason why that information is relevant is because we eat just about everything on the planet, right? We eat all kinds of things, including organisms that are apex predators in their own ecosystem. So like big fish, like tuna, we are at the trophic level above that, or we have placed ourselves at the trophic level above that. So biomagnification is a way by which very small, very trace amounts of a pollutant in an ecosystem can continue to get higher and higher and higher in the concentrations of the tissues at every trophic level we move up. So methylmercury, which is CH3HG, moves up through the food chain via algae eaten by the zooplankton, which are then eaten by fish, which are then eaten by apex predators such as whales and seals and polar bears and people. And at each step of the biomagnification process, the methylmercury becomes more concentrated, reaching dangerous levels in the apex predators. So that's what's really remarkable about this. At the lower levels of the trophic structure, right, the producers and the primary consumers, they're not going to have as much of the pollutant, in this case mercury, in their system as you will get in the top tier predators. So there are certain environmental pollutants that actually affect the apex predators in an ecosystem more than they affect any other organism. And if you lose the apex predators, then the entire ecosystem is going to be out of whack. Think about in earlier examples when we talked about the loss of gray wolves in parks and how that caused a explosion in the number of, say, elk and other herbivores, which then decreased the biodiversity of all the plant life in there, right? So this can be a major problem. So what's so bad about mercury? Well, it's a neurotoxin. It deteriorates your nervous system. It impairs hearing and speech and gait, which is the way that you walk. You get an unsteady gait. It causes involuntary muscle movements, spasms. It corrodes the skin and mucous membranes, so all of the insides of your internal organs, the insides of your digestive system, they're covered in these mucous membranes, and it corrodes that away. And it causes chewing and swallowing to become difficult because those are processes that are guided by your autonomic nervous system. So we've had a bit of vocabulary already in this video. We had qualitative pollutant and quantitative pollutant, degradable pollutant and non-degradable pollutant. We had bioaccumulation. We're going to keep on with this. So when we're talking about water pollution, really any form of pollution, there are what are called point sources of pollution and non-point sources of pollution. When we think about, say, a company polluting a river, typically what we think about are point sources of pollution. So there'd be like a pipe that's coming out of a factory which is dumping waste directly into the water supply. That is a point source. It's an identifiable, specific location where the pollution is coming from. I have some other examples of point source pollution, but you can just imagine factory waste being dumped into a river. In fact, one of the first videos in this class we talked about the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, where the petroleum product factories making all kinds of petroleum products were dumping their waste directly into the river. So that was point source pollution. And that river, of course, caught on fire and all the fish died. So a point source, the way I remember this, is that you could point to it with your finger. You could point at it and say, that's where the pollution is coming from. It's a point source of pollution. It's coming from a particular location. A non-point source, though, what the heck is that? It's coming from spread out areas. So we've talked about these before when we were talking about watersheds, right? All of the nutrient wastes, all of the nutrients, artificial fertilizers that are being spread on all of the lawns and all of the golf courses and all of the farmland, they can wash out of the soil through rain, and then through that watershed, a massive amount of these nutrients can be funneled into a single location. But you can't point to any one lawn or any one farm or any one golf course and say that is the one place that the pollution is coming from. It's coming from everywhere within that watershed. So a non-point source of pollution is from a distributed area, from a wide area. And maybe the thing that is the pollutant, maybe it's pesticides or herbicides or nutrients, whatever it might be, is spread over an enormous area in very small amounts, but through the watershed it gets concentrated. So you have point sources of pollution and non-point sources of pollution. Water pollution is defined as water quality changes that harm living organisms and make water unfit for drinking, irrigation, or recreation. And the requirements for water to be drinking water are much higher than the requirements for it to be irrigation water. The use of water for recreation also has its own requirements. So the water can be unfit for one purpose but be okay for others. But water pollution is anything that's going to deplete that water quality. It could be things like infectious agents like cholera, silt from erosion. Silt is little bits of particles of clay and dust and dirt and rock. Organic chemicals like DDT. DDT is a pesticide, and like mercury, DDT bioaccumulates, it biomagnifies through food chains, and it affects the top tier predators. DDT was responsible for hawks and eagles and other large predatory birds being placed on the endangered species list. So apex predators, but they have a lot of this poison that's meant for insects in their system because they're at the top level of the food chain. What it did was it thinned out their eggshells, and when birds sit on their nests in order to incubate them, they could crush their own eggs. That lowered the number of births per year, the number of surviving offspring, and if the death rate for the adults remained the same, the overall population was going to shrink generation by generation, and that's what ended up happening. Inorganic chemicals, like a lot of cleaning products that we use, organic wastes, so like animal wastes, are a form of water pollution. Not only do they increase the likelihood that you'll have infectious agents like cholera and other bacteria and viruses inside of that water, but they also require a lot of oxygen in order to break them down. And we talked about dead zones before, right? So some of this material should be familiar. And if you have a lot of organic matter in a water column, it has to be broken down, and that consumes all the oxygen, the dissolved oxygen in the water, and then there's no oxygen left for any of the animal life to be able to breathe, so you get all these fish washing up dead as a result of the organic wastes. So that could be an example of water pollution. And heavy metals such as mercury. So what are the effects of water pollution? Well, as we already mentioned, death of aquatic animals. Fish need to be able to breathe. And not only can their oxygen be depleted, but their entire habitat can be impaired by too much waste flowing in. You can think about solid waste like plastics and things like that flowing into aquatic ecosystems. That is definitely going to cause some habitat degradation. And of course, toxic accumulation from those non-degradable pollutants that can accumulate, biomagnify into food chains. It can disrupt the food chain, which affects non-aquatic organisms through feeding relationships. Aquatic ecosystems are not totally isolated from terrestrial ecosystems. Bears come in order to get salmon every day, right? Insects go back and forth between terrestrial and non-terrestrial areas. Each ecosystem is fundamentally connected to all of the adjacent ecosystems. So bad news for aquatic ecosystems is bad news for all ecosystems. Some of that water pollution can be avoided by a couple of different options. So planting buffer zones. I mentioned that a lot of nutrient pollution and herbicide and pesticide waste comes from farms. You could plant strips of trees, strips of forest, in between farmland and the local water source. And that will absorb a lot of the excess nutrients that are through there and give it, it'll slow down the pace of the water, which gives more time for these pollutants to be able to degrade before they actually end up going into the water source. The effect of a vegetative buffer zone between farmland and a water source is that it effectively cleans the water before it actually enters the aquatic ecosystem. Locating feedlots away from water sources. I mean, there's an idea. If a lot of animal waste is making its way into water sources from ranches, why not locate the ranches away from where the wastes can directly and strongly diffuse into those water sources? So just move them a little bit further uphill. using non-toxic chemical substitutes. So nowadays you get a lot of different cleaning products, and not all of them are going to be inorganic compounds. You can get a lot of natural cleaning products that degrade much more quickly in the ecosystem. And the same goes for pesticides and herbicides and detergents and things like that. On the right-hand side of this slide, I have a notice that was posted around London when there was a cholera epidemic, and you can see some of the advice that was dispensed for avoiding cholera. Be temperate in eating and drinking. So eat and drink less. That's a good way to avoid cholera. And definitely avoid eating raw vegetables and unripe fruit. Abstain from cold water and ardent spirits, so avoid alcohol and cold water. Sleep and clothe warm. Do not sleep in the draft of air. The idea that being physically cold is what makes you sick was very strong at this point in time. And honestly, that hasn't really gone away. People still think that being physically cold is what causes you to get sick, as opposed to bacteria and viruses. So what is the deal with cholera at this point in time? Well, cholera, which is caused by a bacterium, Vibrio cholerae, was common in the 1800s, and it's a waterborne illness. So water-related spread has been eliminated by modern water treatment and sewage systems. This is why we add a little bit of chlorine to our water supply in order to kill any bacteria. We also sometimes use systems with ultraviolet light that would kill any bacteria that is in there, but we especially make sure that our water supply is free of bacteria now. But back in the 1800s, we didn't know about. We didn't realize that's what was making us sick. We hadn't developed the germ theory of disease yet. In fact, we were operating off what's called miasma theory. Miasma theory says that the reason why you get sick is that you interacted with bad smells, with bad air, malodorous air, right? A malady, bad odor, malodor. And that is why you got sick. It's a really good example about how scientific misunderstanding or bad science information can exacerbate a problem. So there's this guy by the name of John Snow who thought maybe it's not, he was getting some doubts about this miasma notion, and he thought that probably it was the water supply that people were drinking that caused cholera instead. And he said, hey, I think it's the water supply, and no one believed him because we all believed in miasma theory at the time. So he went through a neighborhood that had been struck by cholera recently, and he interviewed hundreds of people, and he discovered that all of the people who had contracted cholera got their drinking water from a particular water pump on Broad Street. The individuals in the same houses as the people that lived there, or the same buildings as the people that got cholera, that did not contract cholera, all of them universally went to a different water source in order to get their drinking water, or they were employed at a nearby brewery and they typically drank alcohol. They drank beer for their hydration needs rather than water. So they also were not getting their water from Broad Street pump. And what he realized is that washerwomen had been washing out dirty clothes and used diapers, cloth diapers, in a pool that was nearby that pump. So some of the waste from those diapers was getting into the water supply and was being pumped through this pump, and that was a breeding ground for cholera. So he, by just using a map and interviews and on-the-ground science, very well demonstrated that it was probably this one water pump that was causing the cholera outbreak. So he had the officials remove the handle from the pump so it couldn't be used. And no one else got cholera. And the people who had it, they eventually got better. They got their water from different sources. But by removing the pump handle, he was essentially conducting an experiment. He was showing a causal relationship. If people are getting sick from cholera because of the water from this pump, and later we realized because of the bacteria in the water in this pump, then if we remove that from the equation, no one else should get sick, and that's what happened. Remember in Unit 3, I talked about how one of the things that has increased the human population, that has decreased our death rate, is just scientific knowledge, just understanding of what actually is making us sick, and then systematically eliminating those things that are causing us to be unhealthy. healthcare, sanitation. These are some of the biggest achievements of mankind. Another way we can evaluate water quality is not just how clear it is or how free of bacteria, but what is the biological oxygen demand in that water. You may remember this from the water quality analysis that we did when we were checking what the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water supply was, or from the microscopic water analysis lab that we did when we were talking about the macroinvertebrate index as a indicator of biological oxygen demand. So what is biological oxygen demand? It's the amount of oxygen consumed by organisms while they're utilizing the materials in that ecosystem. So here it says the organic matter. If, and you guys know this already, if a aquatic ecosystem gets a lot of waste, a lot of like feces, animal waste, kind of things like that, or even just leaf litter from other places in the watershed washing into it, that organic matter needs to be broken down, which uses up all of the oxygen. So if there is plenty of oxygen available, that means that there's low oxygen demand, and therefore the water quality is good. The more dissolved oxygen there is, the less likely it is that there's a lot of organic waste being dissolved in that ecosystem. So low biological oxygen demand is good. And the more oxygen that's available in the water column, the more kinds of organisms can survive. Only a few very, very, very specific, very specialized organisms can survive in low oxygen conditions. Down here on this chart, you can see that you have just a couple of kinds of worms that can survive, and they usually have this blood red color to them because they have an excess amount of heme protein in order to deal with the limited amount of oxygen in that environment. But those are specialists. So if you can only have specialists alive in an ecosystem, it's not going to be very diverse. The more oxygen there is, the more other kinds of organisms will be able to survive. So the less organic waste that washes into ecosystems, the more biodiverse the ecosystem will end up being. So another effect of water pollution is a reduction of biodiversity. Now, what do you need to remember about biological oxygen demand test-wise? Know what it represents, right? The amount of available oxygen as a result of how clean the water is from organic pollutants, and know that having low biological oxygen demand is better.